Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's asynchronous course content. This week, we are going to be talking about academic inclusion. And so we're going to talk about the definitions of inclusion, what the benefits are. You're going to learn about the cascade of instructional options. How do we plan for inclusion in a general education setting? How do we identify and train peer supports to support our students and effectively support our students? We're going to talk about embedded instruction and what that looks like. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we create access for students with complex support needs within general education instructional strategies. So, for example, if we have a student who is not a vocal communicator and who uses an AAC device, how would they participate if the general education teacher were doing something like Think, Pair, Share, for example? As always, your objectives are not only in the PowerPoint, but they are also on Canvas if you would like to go over those. All right, let's start with the definitions of inclusion. And I said definitions because there are many definitions to inclusion. If you dig into it, you'll find a number of definitions. And one of the things that I have noticed is that most often people's definition of inclusion is directly related to their personal and professional philosophies of inclusion. So there's a direct correlation between those two in my experience. So we're going to look at today two definitions of inclusion and two very different definitions of inclusion. Now, I do want to let you know that at the end of this slide, I'm going to ask you how you would reconcile these differences. And one of the ways you can share that is to tell me what your definition of inclusion is. You might use one of these definitions. You might really relate to, for example, the Mastro Pieri and Scruggs definition, or you may have a combination of different definitions. But again, just to let you know that as you're thinking about these, that is going to be the first question on your submission for this week. All right, so let's look at Mastro Pieri and Scruggs definition, which they defined inclusion back in 2000. So their definition is when students with disabilities are served in the general education classroom under the instruction of the general education teacher. So in the general education classroom, receiving instruction from the general education teacher. Well, then in 2020, Kurth et al. Defined inclusion differently. And their definition sounds something like this, that inclusion is a process that helps overcome barriers to presence in inclusive settings, participation in inclusive settings, and achievement in school for all students. So again, overcoming those barriers in presence and participation, and then looking at students' achievement because we know that the higher our students' achievement, the better their long-term outcomes. They also defined inclusion as the strategies and the services being taken to the students. So that may be different than your current situation. So instead of bringing a student to, for example, a self-contained classroom to receive explicit instruction or constant time delay in reading or being taken to the speech and language pathologist for those therapies, the services and strategies are taken to the student where the student is. And the purpose behind that is that students can continue to be participating members of that inclusive community, and they can continue to make progress not only in the curricula, but also on their IEP goals, their individualized goals. They also furthered the definition by identifying it as an ongoing process. You don't decide that a student is going to be placed in a self-contained classroom and that's where they are and they just stay there. Inclusion is an ongoing process. And not only that, it's a practice that is grounded in social justice. And so what does that mean? I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. There are a number of examples and you could come up with ones that I'm sure I couldn't. But it's things like, do students with complex support needs have a right to be included with their same age peers? That's based in social justice. Do students with complex support needs have a right to have the same educational opportunities as their non-disabled peers? For example, do students with complex support needs have a right to self-determination and to make a determination of who they want to work with or where they want to work? So again, this definition is grounded in social justice. And so what I want you to do now is to stop your video and to you can just do a quick write-up about how you reconcile all of these different definitions. Do you lean more towards one towards the other? Is there a combination or do you have your own definition? So stop your video and after you answer that question, come on back and we'll keep going. All right, welcome back. So now we want to look at IDEA. Does IDEA require inclusion? And the answer is no, it does not require inclusion. But what it does require is the least restrictive environment that is most appropriate to meet the student's unique needs. So it does require the least restrictive environment. And when you are discussing the least restrictive environment or you're analyzing what is the least restrictive environment for this student, the first place you begin is the general education classroom. Now, I want you to hear that again. When you are thinking about and discussing the least restrictive environment for any student, that analysis of where the student should be, where they should receive services, starts in the general education classroom. The discussion starts because that is considered overall for any student. If we're looking at what is the general least restrictive environment, it is the general education classroom. But by law, school districts must provide a continuum of placements. So that could be everything from a hospital or homebound, a separate school, a separate classroom, a resource classroom, push in, general education, and there are other ones that could fall in there as well. But schools must provide that continuum, so we have to consider the placements within that continuum. And then the IEP team decides what degree of inclusion is appropriate for this student. And when they're looking at that least restrictive environment, the first place they consider is the general education classroom. So if this student is going to receive reading services, can the student appropriately receive those services and their needs be met in a general education classroom? If the IEP team determines that they cannot be met, then we're going to look at the next least restrictive environment. For example, could they receive appropriate services from a special ed teacher that pushes in? The answer is no. Could they receive appropriate services from a resource in a resource setting? Then you would move, if that answer is no, to something like a self-contained classroom. But again, always starting with that general education placement. And let me tell you, if you go into an IEP team meeting and you start with this student is going to be in a self-contained classroom, you just broke the law. That is considered predetermination, and we cannot predetermine the placement of a student. It is an IEP team decision. All members have a say, including parents. And not only that, we can't have a student that was in a self-contained classroom this year. Now it's time for their IEP, and we automatically assume they're going to stay in that self-contained classroom. Again, it is a requirement of the law that we look at the continuum of services. So when we're talking about the law, does the federal law require inclusion? And the answer is no. But what they do require, and this goes along with what we were just talking about, was a significant effort to find an inclusive placement. So if the student can participate in an inclusive setting for the full day, can they participate in a full inclusion setting for a part of the day, a portion of the day, an activity during the day? But again, we want to make sure that their unique needs are being met within that setting. And so there's been a big change of focus. When I first started teaching back in the dark ages, there wasn't even we didn't even consider if the students with complex support needs could be included in a general education classroom. That wasn't even on our radar. Let me just tell you that. And then there became a time where we had mainstreaming. Yes, I've been teaching since before mainstreaming. And that was a precursor to inclusion. So during mainstreaming, we did look at like, could a student participate in a gen ed setting? But we were really looking for fun times. We were looking for like low expectation times, things that weren't really rigorous. But that's not where we are now because, again, we've had a change of focus. Now we're not looking at whether students with complex support needs should be included. We're looking at things like how can they be included in an inclusive setting? Where can they be included? When can they be included? Again, looking at all of this within the view of an inclusive setting. How can they be included? When can they be included? And where can they be included? But I want to make sure that when you're making those decisions that you realize that placement does not always guarantee educational benefit. And I know that you're all aware of Andrew F. case, and there is a requirement that students have an educational benefit, but also that we are appropriately ambitious, right? Not only do we want to be appropriately ambitious with their goals, but we want to be appropriately ambitious with their placement as well. But if we have John sitting in the back of the class in a ninth grade, algebra class, and his pair is with him, and this happened with one of my students. He's sitting back there just tearing up magazines. He's not engaging with his peers. He's not engaging with the curriculum. He's not participating in activities. Then we want to make sure that we're looking at that and saying, is there an educational benefit for that? So we need to know things like what's going on in the general education classroom. Are there activities occurring that are meaningful? For example, when I was in Montana, we had farmer in the classroom, and farming was, we had many of our students were either parents were farmers, they lived near farms, they were farmers in their family. So that was a really meaningful activity for our students to participate in. But our students also participated in things like morning meeting and science. So you just wrote a science lesson. You think about your science lesson. Could your students have participated in a gen ed class science lesson that was based on the grade level standard that you taught? Could you adapt the lesson in order to meet the needs of your student within that gen ed setting? Well, the answer is yes, because I saw your adaptations. And you could do that because, again, you're teaching grade level content. But it's really important that you make sure that when we have always, but especially, no, always, that your IEP goals and your objectives are well written. You need to make sure they're well written because you're going to look at embedding those in the gen ed classroom and gen ed activities, or you're going to look at it and say, like, how am I going to meet them within that setting? Or is there another instructional option out of that cascade that I might need to employ to meet those students' individual educational goals? And so we used to really do inclusion. It was really based on social inclusion. That's what we looked at. And I'm going to tell you, this is still the case today. This is not ended, although we want to make sure that we're looking at it, we're extending these thoughts. And so, most often, again, we've looked at social inclusion and decisions about students with complex support needs being included in their gen ed in a gen ed setting have most often been made based on three things. This is what people have looked at: is one, does the student fit in the general education classroom? Now, I want you to notice what I said. Does the student fit into the general education, whatever that activity is in that classroom? Not can we modify or adapt this, can we adapt this activity so that all students can participate? So that's not what it's often looked at. It's looked at, does the student fit? Not only that, often people are considering, can the student benefit socially? We do want to know that. Can they make friends? Because everybody wants to have friends, right? That's a really important part of school. Does it support their communication? Are they able to work on social skills in that setting or work on generalization? So that is important. Now I'm going to tell you this next one, this third question. This is the one that will keep students out of inclusion faster than anything. Faster than anything is, does the student have behavioral skills to engage in the general education classroom? And I know that some of you probably immediately went to students with challenging behaviors and were like, nope, they don't have those behavioral skills. And while challenging behaviors will exclude you more than it will include you anytime now, I want you to know that those skills can be taught, though. They can be taught. They can be taught in your classroom. They can be generalized into a general education classroom, or they can even be taught in a general education classroom. But the skills, behavioral skills that often lead to inclusion or exclusion, aren't always behavioral in the way that you're thinking. It can be things like, does the student call out? Is the student able to raise their hand and wait to be called on? Does the student sit and remain in their seat or in an area until the completion of the activity? So it's not always like really challenging behaviors. It could also be something like, does the student have the ability to write? That is a behavior that has often kept students out of general education classrooms. But what we want to make sure that we recognize is that students also need the opportunity to learn that academic content in a general education setting. So think about what your students would have learned, how their experience would have been expanded, and what content they would have been exposed to and possibly learned if your science lesson was taught in a general education setting with their general education peers. All right, so now we're going to talk about the cascade of instructional options. And so there are two like extreme versions of the cascade of options. And one of them is that all students are doing the same activities, they have the same objectives, and that they are being done in the same setting. So same activities, objectives, and setting. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum are students with disabilities are doing different activities. They have different objectives that are not related to what their gen ed peers are doing, and they are in a separate setting. And oftentimes that could be a separate classroom or a separate school. So what we're going to do is look at the different options within that cascade. And so the first option is called unadapted participation in general education curriculum. So this is where all students, regardless of disability or not having a disability, are doing the same activity. They have the same objectives and they're in the same setting. So oftentimes people think of this as full inclusion. Full inclusion, everybody is in the same location doing the same thing, same activities, same objectives. And so when you're making a determination if this is the instructional option for your students, one of the things you want to consider is, can the students complete the activity as written for the general education classroom? Because remember, this is unadapted participation. The next option is called adaptations to the general curriculum. And this is where the activity is the same, the objectives are related, and the setting is the same. And so this might be something like you're doing a read aloud of Two Roads. Everybody can participate in that. Everybody is listening to the story while they're doing a read aloud. And then what we're doing is that they're doing the same activity. Everyone is answering comprehension questions. So everybody's doing the read aloud, everybody's answering comprehension questions. However, the students with complex support needs are very specifically answering comprehension questions related to who and what, for example. Whereas the general education students, their questions might be more general or more specific based on the goal, on the objectives that they have. So everybody's doing Two Roads, everybody is answering comprehension questions, but our students are still answering comprehension questions, but their objectives a little bit different, and they're all doing it in a general education setting. And so when you're thinking about this option, you want to think about, can the students meet the lesson objectives with just minor modifications, such as additional time or the use of an AAC device? All right, now we're going to look at our next instructional option. This is when skills are embedded within the general education curriculum. So students are doing something similar, but it's not the same. Their objectives are related, and the setting is the same. So activities that are similar. So in this case, it might be that the students, same thing, we're reading the story Two Roads, and the activity is similar in that the students in sixth grade are writing a 3-paragraph essay. We're all doing something similar. Our students, however, are writing a few sentences, 2 sentences, 3 sentences, using sentence frames. And so they're doing something that's similar. They're both doing writing. They're both writing, and they're doing writing related to the story. But the gen ed students are writing a 3-paragraph sentence essay. We are writing 3 sentences, for example. But the objectives are still related. We want to, for example, express our knowledge, or maybe we're writing about story elements, and we're all doing that in the gen ed setting. So when you're thinking about embedded skills within the general education curriculum, you want to think about things like, are there components of the activity that can be met by the students, even if it's not the central objective of the lesson, but it matches an IEP objective. So maybe in this case, our students were learning to construct a sentence using a word bank, and that is on their IEP. All right, the next one would be that you have some kind of functional curriculum that is in the general education classroom. This one, students are doing a different activity, they're doing different objectives, but they might be related. They're in the same setting. So you're thinking about things like are the class activities greatly related to the IEP their IEP goals, or are they unrelated? Maybe they're greatly unrelated to it. Or are there IEP objectives that could be met in the same setting? So again, different activity, different objectives, same setting. And then our final option would be a functional curriculum outside of the general education classroom. And I do believe this is the option that some of your students are in. So the activities are different, the objectives are different, they are not related, and they are in a completely different setting. So you're looking now at like, are the classroom activities greatly unrelated to the student's IEP, or are their objectives better met in a separate setting because they require specific types of equipment, or they need lessons repeated multiple times, which is the situation for some of our students. All right, that is the end of our definitions of inclusion and the cascade of instructional options. So do a quick check-in with yourself. How are you feeling about things? As always, if you have any questions, make sure you add those to your document. You can email them to me. You can also ask in class at the beginning if you would like, because questions are always welcome. All right, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.